First topic of our annual summit in September 2011 was going to be extremism and how the private sector can work with the public sector to counter extremism. Obviously, the breadth of what we focus on here at Concordia has evolved more into focusing on how the private sector can work with the public sector on all topics, but extremism really, combating extremism is really at our roots, and we are really honored today to have with us Senator Evan Bayh and the Secretary General of Amnesty International, Salil Shetty, and also Jonathan Alter, who's going to be interviewing them. So please join me in welcoming them.
With that, I'd like to start the conversation by trying to take a look at what the root causes of terrorism is and extremism in the world that is afflicting us. And I don't think that we can fully confront it by military, diplomatic, political, economic, other means, unless we really understand it. And we're not going to fully understand it today, but I wanted each of you to take a stab at what you think are the root causes and what are the myths about the root causes. Start with you, Governor.
Well, first of all, Jonathan, thank you for your kind words, and Nick, thank for his kind introduction as well. Jonathan and I have known each other, this is in the interest of full disclosure, since 1976. If you want to know how the security environment in the world has changed, just think about the fact that Jonathan and I were actually security guards at Madison Square Garden for the Democratic National Convention in 1976. Speaking for myself, I couldn't come anywhere close to being qualified to fill that role today. So
we were teenagers.
Yeah,
too.
we were just about 20. I was 20 at the time. So in any event, it was a different world, and it's great to be with you again. And Salil, it's great to be with someone who's dedicated his life to human rights and human development for people who need that. So it's great to be with you. And thanks to all of you. So quickly, the root causes, well, they're varied, and regrettably, it will take, not surprisingly, some time to try and address them. So this phenomenon may be with us for a while. Let's start with demography. There's a great upsurge in the number of young people across many of the countries that are afflicted with radicalism, and then the manifestation that it takes all too often in forms of terrorism. You look at the average age in a place like Saudi Arabia or Egypt or Jordan or some of these places, the average age is very low. So you have a lot of young people coming along. So number one, demography. Number two, many of the economies are not terribly robust. Occasionally they'll have a higher rate of GDP growth, but it's off a pretty low base. And not unlike many other parts of the world, the distribution of that growth tends to be a little disproportionate. So demography, a lot of young people. Economic underperformance, they kind of wonder, where's my place in the global economy going to be at a time when those countries aren't terribly competitive outside of natural resources. Number three, Jonathan, the political systems don't give, in many of these countries, an outlet to the aspirations for these younger people coming along. So that would be number three. Number four, in many places, there is either not a very robust educational system, or to the extent that there is, all too often it's based on madrasas, which several of them seek to instill in these young people a sense of a radical interpretation of their religion. So that would be number four. And the final thing I'd mention, number five, would be these very often are traditional cultures. The pace of change because of modernity, because of technology and all that, has been very swift. And in some places, in more traditional cultures, there can be resentment toward the cultural influence that the West has had on some of these very traditional places and the pace of that change. And so you kind of add all that together, and to my way of thinking, those are some of the root causes. They're complex and going to take a while to deal with, and that's why, unfortunately, we may be having this panel topic for some time.
Just want to follow up on one thing. Are the Saudis still funding most of those madrasas? And if they're funding any of them, why hasn't the United States been much tougher in insisting that if we want to continue to have a good relationship with Saudi Arabia, they must use their influence to shut them down?
The Saudis are doing better in that regard. As you recall, several years ago, there began to be attacks within the kingdom. They have felt threatened themselves. Their security services have focused internally much more robustly and have focused on some of the funding sources and have cooperated with us. That said, Jonathan, there are still individuals, not the government of Saudi Arabia, but there are still wealthy individuals who, for a variety of reasons, fund some of these organizations, madrasas in Pakistan and elsewhere, because of their own embrace of the Wahhabi interpretation of Islam.
So a lot of them are hypocrites, and they like to then go to London and go, whoring or whatever they might want to do in their spare time. Why can't we freeze their international bank accounts and otherwise use more leverage to keep them from funding these madrasas? These include not just Saudi Arabia, these include wealthy individuals from the Gulf states.
Well, where they violated the law, there's very robust intelligence sharing between ourselves and the Brits for sure. And we have a pretty cooperative intelligence relationship with Saudi Arabia. Now, in order to freeze assets and that sort of thing, they have to have broken the law in the country of jurisdiction, either in the UK or Saudi Arabia. If they've violated the United States law, we could freeze their assets or account here, conceivably, if you can get a judge's order. But it tends to be a little opaque, let's just put it that way, to kind of trace the money to the individual, and then you get into a whole debate about one person's madrasa is, in many of the tribal areas in Pakistan, there was no educational system. So the legitimate side of the argument was that these madrasas were filling a void to attempt to provide some sort of education to young men. Women really are excluded from that. But then they veered off into more radical or religious type activities, and therein lies the seeds of some of our problems. So you do get into a debate about what is legitimate education, what is illegitimate education, and when is a school responsible for what a handful of their graduates do as opposed to. So at one of these madrasas, you might have a small group ends up going into jihad and joining a group like Al-Qaeda, but it's not the majority. And so what do you do when 90% of them are responsible citizens, but a small minority engages in that kind of behavior? Therein lies part of the problem.
Salil.
Thank you, Jonathan. Again, thanks to Concordia for having me here. And just in the interest of full disclosure, I was not a security guard at the Democratic Convention, which seems like I missed a very fun event. Just a word about Amnesty International because what I say later, it needs to be contextualized a bit, because Amnesty is a global human rights movement. It's made up of people, more than 7 million members and activists and supporters. We don't take any money from governments or corporations for any of our research or campaigning, so we're not at anybody's bidding, so we can be completely independent and impartial. All our work is based on ground empirical evidence conducted directly by our researchers. We don't use secondary data for making whatever statements we make, just so you have that. So the word terrorism is a very tricky word, and we've been very careful about how we use it, because it's a legally contested word. There is no agreed definition. Amnesty believes in the right of people to protest, but peacefully. So to the extent that when we say terrorism, we're referring to attacks on civilians or non-combatants, we would obviously never accept that. We don't take the idea that it's unavoidable or that it can be justified in any way is simply not something we would accept. But having said that, there's no question that since 9/11, probably the greatest number of human rights violations have been caused under the pretext of counterterrorism. So the attack on terrorism has itself become a basis for human rights violations in a very substantive way. Many dictators across the world have found this a very convenient way of stifling dissent. So when the US tries to do this, probably does it from one perspective, but now, so anybody you don't like pretty much is called a terrorist, and you can get away with trampling the law. So I wanted to just, there are good terrorists and bad terrorists, and so one man's terrorist is another woman's liberation fighter. So I'm very careful in using this term, and in fact, we avoid it to the extent possible, just so you know. Now, you asked about the causes. I'm happy that I have 5 as well, Senator. So I would say that the number one cause is the lack of respect for anything that's different. The intolerance, the discrimination, and the violence against anybody who's seen as something we can't relate to. I would say, and this is both within countries and at the macro global level. So the fundamental cause for terrorism, if you want to use the word, is injustice and human rights violations. So we are in a cycle there. So you start having injustice, discrimination, violence, then you have this kind of violent protests, and it's not just about Islam. So the demonization of Islam is a second major cause. Where I come from in South Asia, where women, the treatment against women the violence against women is just shocking. You could call them women terrorists because they've all organized themselves as self-defense groups. Many of them have taken to violence. You could call them as women terrorists if you would like. So I think the fact of the matter is that once you have, and sometimes it's perceived injustice, sometimes it's real injustice, but the fact is the root of terrorism and extremism is in human rights violations. All of the other points that the senator made, I agreed, economic inequality and younger people who feel frustrated, the lack of accountable governments. I mean, the trust in governments across the world is falling. People don't feel that there's a legitimate route to voice their concerns, that they don't have they can't participate in the governance process. So all of this adds to it. At the global level, the other point, which I'm sure we'll keep coming back to, is the issue about the inconsistent use of human rights standards. So you raise the issue of Saudi Arabia. So the US is always way more careful on criticizing Saudi Arabia or Bahrain because they're seen as friends. When it comes to Iran or now Syria, they would go on overdrive to criticize them on human rights. I'm not to say that the Iranian government and the Bahraini or all of the other Syrian Assad regime have anything to defend themselves. I mean, there's enough blame to go around, but I'm saying that the fact that there's an inconsistent use of these human rights prescriptions, double standards around it, is a big cause at the macro global level on why we have these problems. So in the context of right now, the biggest discussion is around the Islamic State and what's happening in Syria and Iraq, and there all our groundwork is showing that the fact that the Shia militias have been allowed to run amok with massive violence against the Sunnis is a fundamental cause of what's going on. So current and past human rights violations being allowed to continue in this way. In no way can you justify what the Islamic State is doing, but if you're asking me for causes, those are the causes.
But is the Islamic State in a different category than some of these groups where, as you said, one man's freedom fighter is another man's terrorist? Are they at a level of evil that should convince the world that we need to unite against it the way we have pure evil in the case of the Nazis or other...
I mean, I think it's just, it's very unfortunate that our threshold is constantly going higher and higher, that we need beheading to show up on television channels in order for us to take action against human rights violations. So if you're referring to that, yes, I mean, it is in a different league, the fact that they want to put that out in the public domain. But if you're referring to human rights violations, I don't know how I distinguish between Al-Nusra and Islamic State, all of these people. I mean, the fact is the city of Mosul with over 1 million people are not being allowed to get food, medicines, the basic necessities. They used to get it from northern Kurdistan. That's being blocked. So the only people who can give them some help right now is the Islamic State, and they're bringing it through the Syrian side. So, so it's the idea that these are few people with zero support is just it's a good mythology, a kind of a propaganda, but it's not a fact.
So if they do have popular support, what is the most effective way over time to prevent the establishment of an Islamic State?
Well, I mean, it's once you address the causes, I mean, fundamentally you need to deal with the causes. That's the only long-term solution, and some of it is really long-term stuff. It's about human rights education, what you do in schools, addressing the disaffection of younger people, it's jobs, it's all of those long-term things. But in the short term, it's fundamentally about ensuring that people who are, preventing violations from happening, because the Iraqi government and the Assad regime on the other side, the extent of human rights violations is just shocking. I mean, they're just getting away with it. I mean, the US had huge leverage on the Iraqi government, which they didn't use when it comes to human rights violations. So now we are left in this situation where we are dealing with the, the consequences of that. So I think it's not rocket science. You need to have a system which, I mean, they're continuing. What the Iraqi government does is to essentially legitimize Shia militias from abductions, torture, disappearances. Amnesty International's big campaign is around death penalty. That's a long-term campaign. The death penalty, which is essentially the state using executions, has gone through the roof in Iraq. So they just take anybody they don't like and they execute them. So that's legitimizing human rights violations in its most extreme form.
So I think that's a an important contextual point for people, but the bottom line, during World War II, Amnesty International, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, supported the Allies and the use of force to remove
Amnesty International
Adolf
was created
Hitler.
in 1961.
61?
So, but
Other
I'm happy to take some
Thank you.
credit.
That's why I said correct me if I'm wrong. So I was wrong about that. A number of other international peace and human rights organizations decided that there are extremely rare cases in human history when their normal approach needs to be set aside in order to remove, or in this case, as President Obama puts it, degrade an evil organization. And so the question is whether this meets that threshold or not, and whether you think that, at least as not as a real solution, but as a tactical short-term matter, that bombing their installations is appropriate now.
The way we are not an organization which has expertise in military decisions, and we don't have intelligence on these questions. So we are not a pacifist organization. We are not. We don't have a fundamental view that you can't use force under any circumstances. But we stay out of that. We approach it from a victim-centered human rights violations approach. So in this case, when the bombings have started, for us the focus is how do you protect civilians? Bombing is one thing, but you have to operate within the frame of international humanitarian law. So you can't have indiscriminate shelling, you can't have disproportionate shelling. How do you protect civilians? How do you distinguish between civilian objects and military objects? That would be our focus.
So let's get to the heart of what Concordia is about, and that is creation of some imaginative partnerships to address some of these root causes, to address the humanitarian crisis. What do you think are the sort of best approaches to creating a multiplier effect with partnerships?
So, to the extent that when we, Amnesty works in partnership with communities, with victims, with civil society, so that's our natural, when we say partnerships, that's our natural understanding. Now, when it comes to governments, we do a lot of work in terms of supporting governments, in terms of building accountable institutions, like a justice system, a police which is human rights friendly, a community policing approach, and all of those things. But obviously, we don't work in partnership with governments because we have to maintain a critical distance. When it comes to businesses, we've done 2 or 3 things which are quite interesting, which I do want to share with this audience because I think it opens up some possibilities for future work. I would assume that in very volatile circumstances like you have in Iraq and Syria, it actually becomes very difficult for businesses to even work there or to invest there. So there would be less kind of density of investment and corporate presence. But leaving those highly kind of conflictual situations, looking more broadly, we've done 2 or 3 things which I'll quickly touch on. One is the use of satellite imagery, and particularly in places where it's difficult to get access, like places like North Korea, or recently we've used it in Ukraine in the conflict with Russia, where you can't get access. So, I think technology companies, we work with them on using sat imagery to expose the truth and do the analysis around it, which is very important. But it's not, since Amnesty International is independent, it's not like a NATO satellite imagery. It's something which we do outside of any governmental interference. And the second, we've done a very interesting thing with called the panic button using mobile phones, and I don't know if you want me to touch on
Yes,
that.
I was going to just ask you about that. Yeah.
So, I mean, this is really to protect human rights defenders and activists from being attacked. You know, if you're, say, a woman human rights defender, so if you have a mobile phone which has got a simple app which gives a geolocation, so if you activate it, people know where you are, so you're saved from attacking. You have a network of family, journalists, lawyers, whoever you want to kind of send a signal out saying you're being attacked. And here we worked with Google, we worked with people like ThoughtWorks, and IDEO, which is a design, a software design company. We worked and we've opened it up, so we've crowdsourced, we've used hackathons, code jams to get people to help us with the design, and that's now on Google Play Store, so that's an interesting kind of practical application which we've developed as well.
I'm actually doing research in my own work now on this, and I'm really interested. Do you think that cell phone penetration it has some negative consequences? It's used for illicit purposes, but do you think on balance it's a positive thing?
No question. I mean, I have no doubt. I think more than what most governments and NGOs have done to open up information flows and, in a sense, democratize information flows, the cell phone has done more for it than anybody else.
Anybody who wants to give me their card afterward, I'm researching this question right now. But let's talk about some of the, while we're on the subject of phones, Evan, I think some of you have read in the paper that the new iPhone 6 it's difficult, if not impossible, for the government to track it. And Google and Apple, after tech companies rolling over for the government for many years, and a lot of stories about that, have now decided that they want to stand up to the government on this. What are the consequences of that?
In terms of dealing with global terrorism, Jonathan?
Yeah.
Or U.S. civil liberties?
Both.
Well, obviously both. You have to find a way to try and do both. You can't just change the DNA of what our country is, which is based upon freedom and civil liberties for the sake of security. At the same time, as Salil pointed out, when innocent people are killed, that's the ultimate loss of civil liberties. So you have to try and find a way to reconcile those two challenges. I would just start off by saying I'm not a technician, so I'm not intimately familiar with what Apple and Google have done, but I'm familiar enough with what's going on in the world today that put me down as a skeptic about whether that will actually protect the information longer term. And it's not just from the U.S. government. There are other state actors out there that are voracious in terms of corporate espionage. That tends to emanate more from China. Old-fashioned fraud and criminal activity, that tends to be a little bit more from Eastern Europe. And the Iranians are becoming more adept at this sort of thing. The terrorist organizations, not so much yet, but that may come. The Iranians are more into disrupting utilities, flight centers, nuclear reactors here, banks. There's not a day that goes by when top 10 banks in the United States, 24 hours a day, 364 days a year, there's an attempt to a cyber attack on those banks, mostly emanating from Iran. So you got to protect yourself from things like that. And where people are trying to use technology to kill people, clearly you have to protect yourself from that. So it will make that job a little bit harder, but I don't think ultimately it will prevent us from doing what needs to be done, hopefully in an appropriate legal way that is sensitive to civil liberties, to try and basically prevent folks who are out there who are attempting to kill innocent people. And therein lies the challenge. Governments get it wrong from time to time, and particularly some of the governments he was mentioning, they intentionally get it wrong. But there is, in many ways, a moral difference for most of the democracies where we may get it wrong, and tragically there may be a loss of life, that sort of thing. It is not our avowed purpose to actually go out and kill women and children and innocent people. It's a tragic mistake. We try and minimize that sort of thing. Our adversaries, they want to kill as many people as they can, and the more women and children, the more shocking, the better from their standpoint. And that's a fundamental difference.
But as somebody who's on President's Intelligence Advisory Board, when the head of the CIA comes in and says in private what they've been saying in public, which is, this will make it very hard for us to prevent the next terrorist attack. How do you sort out how much of that is bureaucratic posturing and how much of it is true?
Well, that's difficult, and you got to listen. You asked me to put my senatorial hat back on again?
Yeah.
We were, from a policy standpoint and from an oversight of the intelligence community standpoint, intelligence services by their nature are going to want to have as much information as they possibly can. That maximizes the chance that you're giving good advice and that you're discovering threats to people's lives in time to do something about it. At the same time, there's clearly a potential for abuse, and so you've got to listen to all sides. And what makes it particularly difficult, as I mentioned, I'm not a technician. Trust me, of the 100 senators, probably not one of them is sophisticated enough to truly understand the technological subtleties of what's being done here. And so you have to get good advice from people you trust who are coming at this from the right place, which is protecting civil liberties while also protecting people's safety, and haven't just sold out, we want everything regardless of the impact it's going to have on people's civil liberties, because in a society like ours, you can't go there. The pendulum does tend to swing back and forth. Before 9/11, our security services, the FBI, the CIA, and others weren't communicating very well. They weren't working very well together. There were greater gaps in our knowledge. Today, there are still gaps, not as many as there used to be, but there's still gaps. And one of the difficulties is when you get contradictory information. That's not at all uncommon. So you're the President of the United States, or you're the Director of Central Intelligence. There's a plot that you think you've become aware of, but there are gaps in your knowledge, and then there's contradiction in terms of the facts you think you have. What do you do when there are lives at stake? If you don't act, you run the risk of getting it wrong. If you do, or rather, if you do act, you run the risk of getting it wrong. If you don't act, you run the risk of innocent people being killed and folks second-guessing you and say, how could you not have done this? So following 9/11, there was a very robust response. Some people would say too robust a response, and that's one of the reasons the Senate is fighting with the agency right now. There's this big report about the interrogation techniques that were used that we've now banned. We don't do some of those things anymore. So there was an overreaction to that. But previously, perhaps there had been an underreaction to the potential threat. And if we'd been a little more active before 9/11, perhaps something could have been done. So it is a true moral dilemma. But that's why we pay our policymakers the big money, is to reconcile fundamental values that we have when there is friction or potential friction between them.
So in the 1970s, congressional committees looking into the CIA called the agency a rogue elephant, which always stuck in my mind. Now with the
I think
current...
my father was on the committee in those days.
The Church Committee.
Yeah, it was.
So now with the CIA actually spying on Senate staffers, is it out of control? How should that be resolved?
Those are two entirely different circumstances. I've been asked to basically conduct the inquiry into what exactly happened there and to hold the individuals at the CIA who were involved in this accountable and determine what disciplinary measures should be taken, and then to recommend longer-term systemic changes to prevent this kind of thing from ever happening again. So, but it would take a lot more time than we have here today to kind of get into all the details of this. Suffice it to say, Jonathan, there was a lot of confusion, and to say that they were spying on Senate staffers is probably an overstatement. And I'm not allowed to talk about classified things here. We'll have a public report eventually, but suffice it, were things done? Well, look, I can't speak about this. The Inspector General at the CIA has issued a report indicating that 5 individuals did things they shouldn't have done. 2 in terms of being too aggressive in looking at, there was a single computer to share documents, and according to the Inspector General, perhaps they looked to see if documents had gone from the CIA side to the Senate side when they shouldn't have done that. 3 other individuals perhaps were not as forthcoming as they should have been about what they had done when confronted by the Inspector General. Didn't flat out lie, but maybe they should have been more fulsome in their responses. So that's what we're looking into. And it's a problem right now because the level of suspicion within our own government, the CIA, the Senate Intelligence Committee, which is charged with overseeing, they are not getting along at all. As a matter of fact, the level of suspicion is unfortunately very high. But I wouldn't put any of that. Mistakes might have been made, errors in judgment might have been made, But I wouldn't really equate that, Jonathan, with back to the Church Commission, where we were out attempting to assassinate the heads of foreign governments, just flat out assassinate the heads of foreign governments, which following that commission is now a felony. It would be you would go to jail if you were working for the United States government and you attempted to do something like that.
And it's also small, arguably, in comparison to, the CIA missing the emergence of ISIL. In the same way, they failed to predict all sorts of things over the last 50 years. So could you make the argument that the things that get all the publicity are the more marginal things, and it's the big calls, the competency, that it's an issue of competence more than malevolence in some cases?
Well, that's been my experience. I have yet to encounter someone who I would call malevolent. But they're only human, too. And in the aftermath of 9/11, when everyone was saying, how could you not have seen this coming? Why didn't you act to protect the country? There's a natural human instinct to perhaps overreact to that and become a little more zealous. Perhaps that had something to do with determining that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, when in fact, as it turned out, there had been, but there were no longer weapons of mass destruction in Iraq because they didn't want to be caught flat-footed again. And now there's a temptation, having been wrong about that, to go back the other way again and say, well, if there's any ambiguity, we're going to say we don't know because we don't want to reach a conclusion again that's proven to be wrong. And so you've got to, again, strike that balance. And they're being much more forthright now, though. This is a good thing, much more forthright about what they don't know and about when there's conflicting evidence, as opposed to saying we have no judgment whatsoever on the one hand, or reaching a decision on the other hand, as in the case of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, when there really was contradictory evidence and gaps in the evidence about all of that. So they are, they're getting better about being honest about what they don't know, which for the civil libertarians in the room should actually be somewhat reassuring that there's a lot the government doesn't know. So there's a myth out there that the government knows everything, and I can tell you from firsthand experience, that's just not so.
Can I come in on this point, Jonathan? Because I think, on the question of getting the balance right, and I'd like to know what the senator says, because on this issue of mass surveillance, which is kind of the same question in some ways, how do you get the balance right? And here, the international law is generally quite clear about this, that when it comes to governments, the presumption must be maximum transparency. When it comes to individuals, the presumption must be maximum privacy. So the idea that you have a mass surveillance program through the NSA, and then you have the whole attack on Snowden, who in our view, what he did was on balance actually in public interest, because he was pushing for greater transparency and accountability of the US government. But it's not just the US government, there were many other governments involved. And we think this is a case where you get the balance wrong, and then you kind of overreact. And what's the net effect of this? It's had a chilling effect on freedom of expression. So all the dictatorships who actually want to slam down on freedom of expression and information have used this as a great chance. In fact, he's housed in Russia. So that's the kind of paradox of the whole thing.
Happy to have any of your questions on Snowden, who we just touched on for the first time, or anything else. Anybody got a question? Yes.
Sir, I'm sorry for that.
It's fine.
Salil.
You mentioned that since there's no legal definition of terrorism, and because people have said against terrorism, then you're very loath to define terrorism. Yet you seem to very glibly define or attribute or give attributes to counterterrorism. So I'm struck by that inconsistency. Could you speak to that, please?
No, we don't. I was only using it in the context of this session because it's been framed along terrorism and counterterrorism. We focus on human rights violations or violations of international humanitarian law. So if there is any form, and these are fairly clearly defined. So what are war crimes? Where is it mass atrocity? Where is it genocide? Where is it, so we use terminology which is not legally contested in the context of international law. So I was using it only for this session. We talk about security with justice. How do we get the balance? And I agree with the senator that, it's easier said than done. How do you get this balance if you're a decision maker I wouldn't want to be in that place sometimes when you're going to toss that coin. But our presumption, of course, would be more leaning towards ensuring people's human rights.
But
Therein lies the dilemma. Following Mr. Snowden's revelations, terrorist organizations began to change the way they communicated, which will make it harder for us to uncover. It is, in my view, likely that people will die because of some of his revelations. Now, on the other hand, with regard to more transparency and greater protection of civil liberties, that's entitled to some value too. How do you go about balancing those two things? It's a moral conundrum. I tend to come down, and you mentioned perhaps repressive regimes are using some of his revelations themselves to kill people. That would be obviously a weight on the other side. I tend to come down on the side of trying to prevent the terrorist strikes and doing it in as a responsible, civil libertarian way as humanly possible, but trying to prevent the deaths.
didn't President Obama start to show a way, if not out of the conundrum, at least one way of addressing a very thorny situation early in his presidency when he renounced the use of the war on terror? And he said, we can't wage war on a tactic, and our war is against Al-Qaeda, and now our fight is with ISIL. And so does specificity help to lessen some of the abuses that are done in the name of fighting terrorism?
Well, to an extent, yes. But I think going back to the mass surveillance question, the issue is whether there is any way of, is there public oversight on this process, I think is the question. So, because oversight is so crucial. My understanding is that the oversight was not adequate, even to the Senate and to the US bodies. And in the case of President Obama's commitments, I mean, the fact is he announced that Guantanamo was going to be closed in his early days. And that still remains the way it was. And this, I'm talking about, if you sit here, the world looks in one way. If you sit in Palestine, it looks another way. So
but
this is just the way it is.
The United States is a democracy, and Congress won't go along. He's wanted to close it for several years. So I think with that, we're going to wrap it up. This was a very stimulating conversation. Thank you both, and thank you all for coming.